Catherine Walsh was 22 years old and had been feeling invisible for months at the advertising agency Meridian Communications in Chicago. As a marketing intern, her days were filled with routine tasks that no one appreciated. Endless photocopies, folders to organize, automated emails to respond to. She had learned to fly unnoticed, to not take up space, because the less noise she made, the less criticism she would receive. Her colleagues barely knew her name. Some simply called her Copy Girl. What no one in the office knew was that Catherine was fluent in American Sign Language, a skill she had learned not out of curiosity, but out of love for her younger brother Danny, who was born deaf. For her, that language was a family bridge, not a work tool. So she never imagined that one day this knowledge would completely change the course of her life. That morning seemed identical to all the others, until she was sent to the front desk to help with the call overload. Catherine was arranging some folders when she noticed an older man wearing a simple but impeccable suit standing in the lobby. His elegant demeanor contrasted with the discomfort of his gestures. He was trying to communicate with the receptionist, but every word she spoke was met with a wall of silence. The old man moved his hands timidly, using signs that went unnoticed by everyone except Catherine. She immediately recognized those movements. It was ASL, and suddenly the memory of her brother, ignored so many times in similar situations, tightened her chest. Without thinking twice, she put aside her shyness and decided to intervene. Catherine approached cautiously, fearing someone would reprimand her for abandoning her duties. But she couldn't simply look the other way. She introduced herself in sign language and instantly saw the man's eyes light up with relief. His tension transformed into gratitude, and he began to respond enthusiastically. That immediate connection broke the barrier of silence that isolated him from the rest. While the employees continued their routine, oblivious to what was happening, Catherine carried on a fluid conversation with this visitor who, for the first time that morning, no longer felt invisible. The old man explained, through sign language, that he had come to visit his son, but that he didn't have a scheduled appointment and had been treated like a nuisance. Catherine listened patiently, gently translating each expression in her mind. She offered to escort him, and although she doubted whether she was making a risky decision, she guided him through the company's halls. During the impromptu tour, she showed him the offices and introduced him to some employees, interpreting the interactions with the ease of someone who had bridged two worlds all her life. Unbeknownst to her, this selfless act was being observed from a distance by Michael Hartwell, Meridian's CEO. As Catherine walked through the halls with the visitor, the supervisor began to look at her disapprovingly from a distance, clearly uncomfortable with seeing her stray from her assigned tasks. However, she chose to focus on the man walking beside her. He told her with trembling but steady hands that his name was Robert Hartwell, and that he often felt out of place even in spaces that should have felt familiar to him. Catherine nodded, translated a few phrases for curious employees, and smiled to reassure him that he wasn't alone. What she didn't know was that this old man wasn't just any visitor, but the CEO's own father. If you continue reading this far, tell me in the comments where you're following us from. Robert, feeling heard and valued, began to open up more during the tour. He told Catherine anecdotes from his life about how he had often had to silently adapt to a world that seemed unmade for him. As Catherine translated and introduced him to others, she felt an unexpected sense of pride. The skill she had always considered useless at work was transformed into a bridge that humanized everyone around her. Even some employees, who had initially looked at him strangely, began to smile and show interest in what he was saying. The energy of the atmosphere changed completely in just a few minutes. The supervisor, however, didn't see the scene favorably. From her desk, she watched Catherine's every step with growing impatience, jotting notes in a notebook and sighing exaggeratedly. For her, an intern should limit herself to mechanical and obedient tasks, never taking the initiative or deviating from protocol. As Catherine casually accompanied Robert, the supervisor's rigidity seemed to become more evident. The young woman didn't fully notice, but the contrast between the empathy of her gesture and the indifference of her superior began to paint the picture of an inevitable confrontation. Michael Hartwell had just left a meeting upstairs when, through the glass window overlooking the central hallway, he noticed something unusual. His father was walking casually beside a young woman he barely remembered seeing in the office. Michael paused in silence, watching how Catherine naturally interpreted every gesture, and how Robert laughed with an expression he rarely showed in public. That scene moved him because he had been trying to get closer to his father for years without managing to bridge the emotional gap that separated them. And now, suddenly, an unknown intern seemed to have found the key. Meanwhile, Catherine continued her improvised tour, unaware that she had the CEO as a spectator. Her mind was focused on Robert's experience, on making him feel part of the place and not a hindrance. Every word translated, every smile shared, were small victories that added up to a unique moment. As she headed back to the lobby, Catherine felt she had done the right thing, even though a part of her dreaded the imminent scolding from her supervisor. She didn't know that day would change not only her relationship with the company, but also that of a father with his son. Upon returning to the lobby, the tension was evident. The supervisor abruptly stood up, crossed her arms, and gave Catherine a reproachful look. In front of everyone, she accused her of abandoning her duties without authorization and of wanting attention with an unnecessary act. Catherine felt a lump in her throat. Heat rose to her face, and the shame of being exposed like this left her speechless. Robert tried to intervene with signs, but no one else could understand him. The young woman, torn between defending herself and protecting him, barely managed to stammer out an explanation. That's when the scene took an unexpected turn. Michael Hartwell, who had witnessed everything, stepped forward with a firm stride. His mere presence immediately silenced the murmur in the lobby. In a clear voice, he interrupted the supervisor and explained that Catherine had done nothing wrong. On the contrary, she had demonstrated exactly the kind of values the company should foster: respect and dignity for every person, regardless of their position or circumstances. The ensuing silence was laced with surprise. No one expected the CEO himself to intervene to defend a mere intern. At that moment, Michael turned to his father and, to everyone's surprise, began communicating with him using some basic signs he had learned privately but had never dared to display in public. Robert looked at him with glassy eyes, unable to contain his excitement at seeing his son finally making an effort to enter his world. The tension that had marked their relationship for years dissolved in seconds when Michael reached out and hugged him tightly in the middle of a lobby full of silently watching employees. Catherine, still in disbelief, felt she was witnessing something much bigger than a simple work interaction. It was a moment brimming with humanity. Several employees looked away to hide their tears, while the supervisor, now speechless, stepped back in obvious discomfort. Catherine didn't need recognition. Watching a father and son rebuild a broken bridge was reward enough. And if this part also moved you, share it with someone close to you. We never know who a true story like this might inspire. After a few seconds of absolute silence, Michael turned to Catherine and pointed her out clearly in front of everyone. He said that what he had witnessed was not a lack of discipline, but an example of humane leadership, something the company desperately needed. His words shocked everyone present, who were still trying to come to terms with what had happened. Catherine, her heart racing, could hardly believe what she was hearing. She had been prepared for a reprimand or even the loss of her job, but instead, the CEO was publicly acknowledging her as someone who had done the right thing, even against the rules. At that very moment, Michael made an unexpected decision. He announced he wanted to create a new position within the ECA agency, a position that didn't exist until then. He called it Director of Accessibility and Inclusion, and declared that Catherine was the right person for it. The employees looked at each other in disbelief, while she remained motionless, unsure if this was real. The young woman, who until a few minutes ago had been ignored by almost everyone, was now center stage. For the first time in a long time, she felt that her sign language skills had immense value, not only for her and her brother, but also for transforming an entire work environment. It took Catherine a few seconds to react, as if the words weren't directed at her. Her first sensation was absolute disbelief. How could an intern, invisible until that moment, receive such an offer in front of everyone? She felt a heat run through her body, a mixture of embarrassment, nerves, and a spark of pride she hadn't experienced in a long time. Although her instinct was to refuse for fear of not being up to the task, Robert's grateful gaze and Michael's calm firmness made her understand that this opportunity wasn't just about her, but about something much bigger. When she finally managed to articulate a response, Catherine accepted with a trembling voice, aware that this gesture opened up a completely new path in her life. The spontaneous applause of some colleagues, coupled with the awkward silence of others, marked the contrast of a company that was about to change. Michael, satisfied, ended the scene, making it clear that he would not tolerate any more contemptuous attitudes toward anyone. Catherine, still processing what had happened, left with the feeling that that day, which had begun like any other, had become the most important turning point in her life. The following days were a mix of dizzying speed and accelerated learning. Catherine went from preparing copies in a drab office to meeting with executives and proposing changes that had seemed impossible just a week before. Her initial uncertainty clashed with the magnitude of the task, but Michael's trust in her and Robert's constant support reminded her she wasn't alone. For the first time, she spoke up in meetings, and although her hands sweated and her voice trembled, she spoke with the confidence of someone defending a just and personal cause. The first big step was convincing the company to install visual alert systems in all offices so that deaf and hard of hearing employees could be integrated equitably. It wasn't easy. Some executives considered it an unnecessary expense, but Catherine, armed with the experiences she'd shared with her brother Danny, presented concrete examples that were impossible to ignore. Seeing the conviction in her eyes, many began to understand that this wasn't just about complying with a rule, but about transforming the corporate culture into something more human and empathetic. Over time, Catherine organized mandatory awareness workshops where employees at all levels learned the basics of sign language and shared dynamics for putting themselves in the shoes of people with different abilities. What initially generated resistance and murmurings eventually became a space for discovery. Some employees confessed they had never considered how difficult something as mundane as a meeting could be without an interpreter. Little by little, the invisible barriers began to fall, and the work environment became more welcoming and respectful. One of the most visible changes was during corporate events. Catherine insisted on the presence of sign language interpreters at every important presentation, and that decision didn't go unnoticed. Clients and partners began praising the new policy, considering it an example of modernity and social responsibility. What had seemed like a symbolic detail became a hallmark of Meridian communications. Catherine, who had previously hidden behind the printers, now walked with her head held high, knowing that every effort had a real impact not only on the company, but on the lives of many people. The impact of Catherine's initiatives was felt not only in the company, but also in Michael Hartwell's personal life. Inspired by the natural way she communicated with his father, he began taking formal sign language classes and setting aside time each week to practice. At first, her gestures were awkward, but Robert received them with infinite patience, proud to see his son finally breaking down the distance that had kept them apart for years. Their relationship began to rebuild, and this change was evident even to those around them. The agency's employees soon grew accustomed to seeing the CEO and his father sharing lunches in the main cafeteria, something previously unthinkable. Michael, who used to be distant and reserved, was now seen smiling genuinely as he struggled to communicate using sign language, even when he made mistakes. Robert, for his part, had become a beloved figure in the office, greeting everyone with the confidence of someone who finally felt he belonged there. Catherine watched these scenes with emotion, understanding that her intervention in that lobby had been the starting point of a much deeper transformation than she had ever imagined. 6 months later, the efforts of Catherine and the entire team were reflected in an unexpected development. The company was nominated for a National Corporate Inclusion Award. What initially seemed like a series of internal adjustments ended up being recognized as an exemplary cultural shift. When Meridian was announced as the winner, Catherine was invited to take the stage representing the company. As she walked to applause, she recalled all the times she had felt invisible, and this contrast filled her with renewed strength. She was no longer the copy girl. She was a respected professional who had transformed an entire space with an act of empathy. On stage, with the award in her hands, Catherine allowed herself to take a deep breath and look out at the audience. There were Robert and Michael in the front row, smiling proudly. Seeing them united, sharing that moment as a family, moved her almost as much as the recognition itself. For years, she had doubted her own worth, believing she would never live up to expectations in a competitive world. But that day, she understood that what made her different was precisely what made her valuable. She recovered a part of herself she had kept hidden beneath insecurity, and for the first time, she felt whole. Upon returning home after the ceremony, Catherine found Danny waiting for her with a huge smile on his face. He'd been following every piece of news about the award and couldn't hide his pride. Using quick, enthusiastic hand gestures, he told her he'd never doubted her, that he'd always known the skill they shared was a gift, not a burden. Catherine hugged him tightly, feeling that all their hard work now had a much deeper meaning. Not only had it changed her work life, but it had also given her brother a reason to dream big. From then on, Catherine began inviting Danny to some of the agency's activities, where he was greeted with respect and curiosity by the employees. Having grown up dealing with society's indifference, he was surprised to see a corporate office tailored to people like him. Each visit became a reminder of why Catherine accepted the position, because behind every adjustment, every inclusion policy, there were human stories that deserved to be told and valued. For her, there was no greater victory than seeing her brother's dignity reflected in the environment she had helped to build. As the months passed, Catherine's transformation became more evident not only in the company, but also in her personal life. She learned to trust her voice and her decisions, leaving behind the constant fear of making mistakes. Colleagues who had previously ignored her began to seek her opinion and treat her with respect, recognizing the impact of their actions. She, who had silently carried insecurities since college, could now look back and clearly see how a single day, a seemingly small choice, had changed the entire course of her destiny. Catherine's story became an inspiration both inside and outside Meridian Communications. There was no shortage of people requesting her to speak at universities or other business forums about inclusion and accessibility. Although she was hesitant at first, over time she learned to share her experience naturally, explaining that it wasn't a calculated plan, but rather a spontaneous act of empathy. That detail was what resonated most with people, understanding that you don't need an important position to create real change, you just need to dare to see and listen to those whom everyone else ignores. The memory of that day in the lobby never faded from her mind. Catherine understood that life can change in a matter of minutes, and that often true courage is demonstrated in simple, seemingly insignificant gestures. If she hadn't paid attention to that lonely old man, she might still be invisible in an office that would never have seen her potential. Now, however, she had a clear purpose and a new identity built on empathy and the conviction that every person deserves to be treated with dignity. With Danny by her side and the respect she'd earned in her professional environment, Catherine finally found the security she'd sought for years. Her story, which began as that of an insecure intern, ended as that of a woman who opened doors for others and taught an entire company the true meaning of inclusion. Looking ahead, she knew challenges still lay ahead, but she also understood that she would never feel invisible again. She'd learned that her voice mattered and that even a simple sign language greeting could transform entire destinies.